Singapore will be publishing its first report on the digital economy in the next few weeks. Communications and Information Minister Josephine Teo says that it will review how the sector is contributing to the overall economy. Rebecca Mateo tells us more.
When it comes to governance in the digital space, Mrs. Josephine Teo said Singapore has three objectives: expanding opportunities, ensuring trust and safety, as well as strengthening the community. Speaking at a good governance conference, she said what makes that challenging is that there are no ready playbooks. The government also has to tackle the evolving nature of technology and its global reach.
The aim of governance must ultimately be to foster a sense of solidarity and commitment for society to move forward together. Digital governance should also contribute to this objective. Ironically, while digital technologies have drawn the world closer, we sometimes feel more disconnected from even our next-door neighbours and friends. Thus, we need to ask what it will take to preserve bonds between people and communities.
And that's where the report will come in useful. It will shed light on how the digital space is contributing to overall economy and a stock take of efforts to grow the tech workforce and help businesses transform through digitalization. This will help with governance for the common good, which Mrs. Teo said could involve making difficult trade-offs. And when these cannot be avoided, she added that there's a need to mitigate the impact on specific groups.
At the birth of our nation, our founding Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, already warned, and I quote him, "Either we learn to think in terms of the national interests instead of sectional interests, or we are in trouble." Close quotes. This reminder bears repeating as we mark the 100th anniversary of his birth.
While the report is still in its draft form, Mrs. Teo said some trends are worth noting. While the information and communications sector was the fastest growing sector in the past 5 years, SMEs still lag the larger companies in adapting technology, but more are getting on board recently.
For more, we're joined now by Professor Bo Wai Fong, Deputy Dean of the Nanyang Business School at NTU. Good evening to you, Professor Bo. So much work, business, communication is conducted online. Give us a sense of exactly how much the digital economy actually factors in Singapore's overall growth.
Yeah, the digital economy does has a very significant impact on Singapore's overall economy. So first of all, our e-commerce market is really quite big. We have 3 million e-commerce users, and among the Southeast Asian countries, our Singapore shoppers actually have the biggest basket size. And as we know, almost every company, every sector has companies that has invested in digital technologies to improve their efficiency, their competitiveness, and their customer experience. And of course, as a sector, the ICT sector actually accounts for about 7% of the country's GDP. So it's very substantial.
But businesses have been regularly encouraged over the past few years to get on to this digital transformation, and many of them are doing so. It's not so easy for some of the small and medium-sized enterprises, though, to do that. How would you rate Singapore's progress in actually digitalizing firms and growing the tech workforce as well? Because we need the talent. How do we stack up against other economies in the region as far as this is concerned?
Yeah. So recently there was an IMD digital competitiveness ranking that actually analyzed the country's ability to adopt digital technologies and also implement these technologies within enterprises and the government organizations. So very glad to say that Singapore actually ranked fourth in this as the fourth most digitally competitive country in the world. And this is after Denmark, USA, and Sweden. So I think we are clearly ahead of other economies in the region. And this is because Singapore, as you say, have really invested in our education and training programs. Coming from the university, I do see that we have a substantial increase in programs that produce graduates like in the areas of data science, AI, cybersecurity, etc. And Singapore has invested in our digital infrastructure, provides lots of grants to organizations, and more importantly, they have also put in place various regulatory framework to actually support emerging technologies like fintech and AI. So all this contribute to why Singapore is doing well.
So we're seeing development of those tech programs and courses and so on. The training has improved as well. But what more can we do to actually move up in the ranks, Prof?
So in my view, there are a few things that can always be improved, despite that Singapore is doing well. So first of all is tackling the SME sector. And this is not because we are not doing enough, but really SME sector is a very challenging sector when it comes to adopting and using digital technologies. They face a lot of challenges in terms of attracting tech talent, coping with very limited resources, and somewhat resistance to change. So while Singapore has many initiatives, we do have a lot more we should do and can do to actually help SMEs. And I think another area that I think we can do better in is with the startup ecosystem, because startups always play a very big role in creating innovations that uplift the entire tech sector and produce innovative solutions. So Singapore has made huge inroads in building a very vibrant entrepreneurship ecosystem in the world. But our startups also face challenges because our market size is quite small. There is also a tendency to rely on government support and funding. That's why we tend to see a concentration in certain industries like fintech. So I do hope to see in the longer run, we can have a more self-driven entrepreneurship ecosystem, like in Silicon Valley in the US or Tel Aviv in Israel. I think these are some areas we can definitely work more to improve on.
Part of that ecosystem involves the regulations of the sector that you mentioned earlier as well, Professor Bow. What are the challenges, though, to effective digital governance, especially as we're seeing the landscape change so rapidly when it comes to the online space?
Yeah, there are, in fact, lots of challenges. So I think when you talk about digital governance, essentially it's about the policies, the regulations, and the practices that both the government and organizations use to help with the use, to oversee the use of digital technologies. So I think there are a lot of challenges. I think the first is really the need to balance between multiple conflicting objectives. Because on one hand, there's clearly a need to regulate because of the risks that might be relating to the use of these technologies. But on the other hand, adopting such regulatory and compliance practices does come at a cost to organizations. And regulators are constantly aware that they don't want to run ahead of the technology in order not to stifle innovation. So there's this balancing act that organizations and regulators constantly have to grapple with. And I guess a second challenge is really the uncertainty and the constant change when it comes to digital technologies, because they evolve so rapidly. The regulators are constantly running to catch up with all these latest changes. So, for example, with AI, this technology is inherently very probabilistic, and at the same time, the use of these technologies could actually create unintended consequences. So both regulators and organizations have to constantly monitor what could be some outcomes and unintended consequences that they have to guard against, right?
Professor
And I guess
Bow,
lastly is to do with the complexity. Yes.
You can make your last point quickly. Thank you.
Sure. The last point is to deal with the complexity, because digital technologies is inherently international, but on the other hand, we see the regulations tend to differ by countries. So there's a lot of complexities involved in this.
Professor Bo, thank you very much for sharing your insights on this. Professor Bo Wai Fong, the Deputy Dean of the Nanyang Business School at NTU. Thank you.